the cardinals were gathered together at the so-called Fourth Lateran Council. They enacted a series of laws that were meant to define what it meant to be a good Christian, which in that time and place meant a good Catholic. And anyone who fell outside that definition was a heretic. By definition, if you failed to embrace the approved dogma of the Church, you were heretical. There was one particular community of dissident Christians. They were called Cathars. They lived primarily in southern France, although they could be found elsewhere in Europe. And you might think of them as premature Protestants. They were resisting and dissenting from the dogma of the Roman Catholic Church, although they called themselves good Christians. They felt they had a firmer grasp on what Jesus is shown to teach in the Gospels than the Catholic Church did. This was an intolerable situation for the Pope, and he called into existence first a crusade. Now, we're very familiar with the crusade against the Muslims who had sovereignty over the Holy Land, but this was a crusade conducted in France against Christians who were, in the eyes of the Church, the wrong kind of Christian. The so-called Albigensian crusade. It was a crusade against the Cathars.
Now, what was the defining characteristic of the Cathars that seemed to be most threatening to the Church, and also what was making them very popular? And why was there? What about what they were teaching was catching fire?
Well, it's such an interesting phenomenon. There were a lot of people in Europe who felt that the Church had grown too wealthy, too ornate, too complacent, that the princes of the Church, the cardinals and bishops, were leading lives of luxury. They were wearing rich garments and eating rich foods and living in palaces, when Jesus is depicted in the Gospels as advocating a life of simplicity and even poverty. And so the contrast, the hypocrisy between what Jesus modeled in the Gospels and what some of the high churchmen were actually doing in their own lives turned a lot of people against the Church. Now, some of those people were within the Church. They advocated reforms of the Church. One of them was the Pope. Pope Gregory instituted the famous Gregorian reforms, which were meant to address precisely these problems. The Franciscans and the Dominicans were orders called into existence to model the life of Jesus as it's depicted in the Gospels, lives of poverty. And the Cathars did the same. The Cathars advocated and embraced a life of extreme simplicity and self-denial. They ate very spare diets, and they shunned marriage and sex. They believed that the world was the carnal world was an evil place, and they aspired to go back to God and wanted to guard themselves against sin for as long as they were compelled to remain on earth.
Then why would they be persecuted if they were like so many of these other so-called shoeless saints?
Sure. Well, right? It's just the great irony of the Inquisition, precisely as you've pointed out. There was another so-called heretical movement called the Waldensians, some of whom were welcomed back into the Church as long as they subjected themselves to the authority of the Pope. And so they could continue to believe what they believed, and they could continue to practice what they felt was the right form of Christianity as long as they acknowledged the authority of the Pope. The Cathars refused to make that compromise. They put themselves outside the authority of the Church and set themselves as an alternative example of what was the right way to live. And that was intolerable to the Roman Catholic Church, which felt that it had to exercise absolute authority over Christendom and could not tolerate anyone asserting the right to teach a different way to be a Christian.
So the crusade against the Cathars begins And is it originally is the manual written right away that says if you find these folks, you can torture them into submission or kill them, or does that develop organically?
Well, I've given you the first step towards the Inquisition. This crusade against the Cathars was an effort to simply exterminate Cathars through a holy war, and failed. The war was terribly destructive and disruptive, and eventually the princes and kings of Europe realized that it was doing terrible damage, and it was and a peace was imposed on Europe. But the Church was not going to give up its fight against the Cathars, and that's precisely when the Inquisition comes into existence. The crusade against the Cathars failed, and so the Pope tried something different. And what he tried was the Inquisition as we now know it.
Because I want to ask you then about Gnosticism. I want to ask you about the Knights Templar. I want to ask you about various forms that the Inquisition took, and then we'll build up to how that blueprint remains for later on for the Salem witch trials, for Hitler's Germany, for the pursuit of communists in the United States, and perhaps even stories in the news today. Jonathan Kirsch has done all the research for the Grand Inquisitors Manual, A History of Terror in the Name of God, how the Inquisition got started. And so when we come back with Jonathan Kirsch, we'll have to address the question that comes up right away. I haven't answered the phones, but I'm just going to assume that a few people have called in immediately to defend the Church in the Inquisition. It's an interesting spin about that, and Jonathan Kirsch addresses that in the book, and we'll get to it next. On what exactly the Church did and didn't do. Is it really true that they farmed out all the horrible stuff to other people so that technically, at least, their hands are clean? Is that true? We'll find out. We get to the truth behind the myth and the mystery of the Inquisition and how it's still with us today. The Grand Inquisitors Manual, A History of Terror in the Name of God. Jonathan Kirsch, we were just talking about how the Inquisition had kind of developed slowly, starting in the early 13th century. And so walk us through it then a little bit more. So after the Church decides, well, this sort of subtle approach of getting rid of the Cathars didn't work, what do they do then to kind of turn up the heat?
Well, the Inquisition was a formal and, in theory, a universal system of police and courts charged with the task of searching out and punishing those Christians who were held to be heretics, that is to say, Christians who were not good Christians in the eyes of the Church. And this was a formal bureaucracy. It was staffed by the friars and monks of the Franciscan and Dominican order, but it also included constables, guards, scriveners, attorneys, notaries, jailers, a huge bureaucratic staff. And it operated in localities all over Europe where heretics were suspected to live and to practice their faiths. The Inquisitors would generally arrive in a local town or village. They'd preach a sermon calling on all heretics to give themselves up, to confess their sins, and submit themselves to the authority of the Inquisition. The Inquisitors called on anyone who knew of a heretic to turn the heretic in, to denounce him or her to the Inquisition. And anyone who failed to do so was at risk of being arrested, interrogated, often interrogated under torture, tried and convicted as a heretic, and then, if convicted, punished. And there was a whole range of punishments that were available to the Inquisition, ranging from fines and expropriations to the wearing of a symbol that marked the individual as a heretic. It was actually a yellow cross sewn to their clothing. The punishments included compelled pilgrimages, imprisonment in very, very harsh conditions, and of course the ultimate punishment was the very famous auto da fe burning at the stake.